Shamit. She is an award-winning novelist, essayist, and playwright. And currently, she's a staff writer at Vox. She previously worked, as she mentioned a minute ago, as religion editor at The Atlantic, opinion editor at The Forward, in English, I imagine, and not in Yiddish, and associate editor at The Daily Beast. She's also published work at Rumpus, BuzzFeed, Electric Literature, Refinery 29, Two Soul 24, or Haaretz and Tablet and Walrus. She's appeared on NPR, BBC, CBC, and Huffington Post Live. Her 6 plays have been produced in theaters from Vancouver to New York. Sigal earned her MFA in creative writing from the University of British Columbia and her BA in philosophy from McGill University. As we now know, she is originally from Montreal, but lives in Washington. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to please mute. That would be really great. And she now lives in Washington, and The Mystics of Mile End was her debut novel and was nominated for the International Dublin Literary Award and won the Fiction Prize at the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards and the Trade Fiction Book of the Year at the Alberta Book Publishing Awards in 2016. More recently, Sigal published a children's book called Osnat and Her Dove, the true story of the world's first female rabbi. This loose biography relates to the little-known story of the first female rabbi, Osnat Barzani, a Kurdish Jew whose knowledge of the Torah and leadership of a yeshiva in ancient Iraq broke gender barriers. And this book is geared for young people. And with no further ado, it is our great pleasure to present Sigal Samuel.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, and thank you to the shul for having me and to all of you for being here tonight. I know a lot of us by this point in the pandemic have Zoom fatigue, so I appreciate you nonetheless coming and joining us to learn a little more about Osnat Barzani. So this is, as the Rabbi was mentioning, this is my new book, Osnat and Her Dove, and it is geared for kids, and maybe I'll talk a bit later about why I chose to write it targeted to a kid audience. But tonight we're going to have a sort of story time for the adult set. And I'll just tell you maybe a little bit about why I wanted to write this book, what inspired me. And then I'll read it out loud to you since it's quite short. And then we can discuss and you can ask any questions that come to mind. So a little bit about me. As you just heard, I grew up in Montreal, and I grew up in the Orthodox Jewish community there. And when I was a young girl, I had a secret dream that I didn't dare tell anyone. I actually secretly wanted to become a rabbi, but I just sort of assumed that that was an impossibility. Because first of all, I was growing up in the Orthodox world. I didn't see any women doing that. Plus I was my family is Sephardic and Mizrahi. They come from Iraq, India, and Morocco. That's where my grandparents are from. And even the few women rabbis I'd heard of in other denominations, to the extent that I was aware of them, it always seemed to be Ashkenazi women. And I just sort of assumed maybe that's something other women who don't look like me are allowed to do, but someone who looks like me just cannot do that. So it came as a shock to me one night about 5 years ago when I was doing research for a stage play, actually, about Jewish women. And I, late at night, stumbled across an article online about this woman, Osnat Barzani, who I had never heard of before. And this was a scholarly article explaining that Osnat was actually the first woman rabbi. And she actually lived just in Mosul, in what is now Iraq, just a few hours away from my family's hometown of Baghdad. And this was not in, the 1930s or 40s or 60s or 70s. This was in 1590, way back in the 16th century, she was born. So I was really, really stunned by that. And I kind of became obsessed with the story of this woman, started to do a lot of research into the scholarship that exists on her. There's not that much, but there is some, which we can talk about a bit more later. And ultimately decided I wanted to write a book about her. There are no other books about this woman out there. This is the first one. And I specifically decided to write it geared to kids, although I had never written a kids book before, because I think it's really important for young people to know that this woman existed, that this kind of role model existed. I think that if I had known about her when I was a kid, it actually could have potentially changed the trajectory of my life and what I thought was possible for me to be. So I would love for young people growing up today to know that. So I think without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and do a little reading for you. What I'll do is I'll read each page and then I'll turn it so you can see the illustrations. I do not have the artistic talent to render illustrations as beautiful as these. They were done by an Israeli artist named Vali Mintzi. So I'll try to show you each illustration as I go along. And as I'm reading, feel free to think up any questions that are popping to mind for you. You can hold them until later, or you can pop them in the chat function in Zoom down below at the bottom of the screen. And I'll be happy to chat with you about them later. So here's Osnat and Her Dove, the true story of the world's first female rabbi. Almost 500 years ago, when almost everyone believed in miracles, a baby girl was born in the Middle East. Her name was Osnat. Nobody knew it yet, but she would become the first female rabbi in history. Osnat grew up surrounded by books in the city of Mosul. Her father, Rabbi Samuel Barzani, built a yeshiva where men studied Torah all day long. Because Rabbi Barzani often traveled from town to town, building more yeshivas, Osnat spent many hours alone with books. She stared and sniffed. She peeked and poked. What secrets were they hiding? Show me how to read, she begged her father one day. Rabbi Barzani said, girls spend their time on chores. Reading is for boys. But Osnat replied, you don't have any boys. And if your daughter wants to learn, why not teach her? And so he did. Osnat loved the shapes of the Hebrew letters. One looked like a mysterious animal and another a creeping vine. She also loved the answers that the Torah's words provided. Each gave rise to 7 new questions in her mind. During one of her father's travels, Osnat watched from her window as a white dove landed on a nest in a nearby tree. She brought him some leftover kubba from her dinner and dropped it into his open beak. This spicy treat became his favorite snack. Over time, Osnat read to the dove whenever she was lonely. She felt as if he were reading along with her. In this way, they became good friends. One day, Rabbi Barzani returned from a long trip and gazed at his daughter. You look very grown up, he said. Soon it will be time for you to get married. Osnat crossed her arms and objected. If I have a husband, he'll expect me to do chores, and I won't have enough time for Torah study. Rabbi Barzani agreed that would be a waste of Osnat's curious mind. So he told all the young men who came to visit that they couldn't marry his daughter unless they agreed to excuse her from doing chores. The men were shocked. No cooking? No cleaning? No, thank you. But one man, Jacob, was different. He swore that if Osnat married him, she could study Torah all day long. Osnat smiled and asked her father to write up her ketubah, her wedding contract. Then she married Jacob, dancing outdoors as musicians trumpeted on the zorna and drummed on the davul. Jacob kept his promise, and the couple raised a happy family. But eventually, Rabbi Barzani passed away. Osnat cried, missing her father, and her dove cried with her. Jacob became the head of the yeshiva, but he was too busy with his own Torah study to teach the students. They grew restless and rowdy. Osnat knew something had to be done. She began to teach the students herself. As she spoke the Hebrew words, she felt comforted, as if her father were close by. For years, Osnat taught Torah, but then Jacob passed away. Osnat was heartbroken, and with her husband gone, there was nobody to take over as head of the yeshiva. No one had ever heard of a woman leading a yeshiva anywhere in the world. Could Osnat do it? In bed, she tossed and turned. What would the students think if she officially became their leader? One night, Osnat's father came to her in a dream. He didn't speak, but as if to give her a sign, he smiled at her. The next morning, the students smiled too. They already knew what a smart and kind teacher Osnat was. Now she was going to be their leader. What could be better than that? One day, while Osnat was home preparing her Torah lessons, she heard loud noises through her window. A sharp cry, a soft thump, then screams. She ran outside. A hunter was standing over her pet dove. The dove's wings were very still. Children were screaming at the hunter, "You shot the bird." Osnat didn't say a word. She took her beloved pet inside and closed the door. The hunter and children waited outside. They waited and waited and waited. Finally, the silent air filled with rustling. The door opened and the dove came flying out. The crowd looked at Osnat with astonished eyes. Had she healed him? Rumors of Osnat's power spread across the city. Many came to her for blessings. The sick, the poor, the heartbroken, all believed she had the power to heal them. At Osnat's yeshiva, the men called her Tanait, a title given only to the most respected teachers. They said she knew the deepest secrets of the Torah, and that's where her power came from. Rabbis from near and far began sending her letters. One called her, "My mother, my rabbi." Another letter invited Osnat to celebrate Rosh Chodesh, the holiday of the new moon, with the Jews in the town of Ahmadiyya. Osnat traveled there with her dove. When she arrived, Osnat was disappointed to see that the townspeople were celebrating inside their synagogue in the weak light of a few candles. "Come and dance outside," she said, "in the light of the beautiful new moon." They celebrated under the open night sky, dancing and singing until they smelled smoke. It was a good thing they were all outside. The synagogue was on fire. The precious Torah scrolls were still inside. Osnat acted fast. She whispered the secret Hebrew names of angels, which her father had taught her. At the same moment, her dove flew into the sky. Some of the panicking people, peering through the smoke, thought they saw the bird multiply into many birds. Some thought they saw angels. The white creatures beat the flames with their wings until they put out the fire. Then they disappeared. When the smoke cleared, the townspeople found that the synagogue was not burned. The Torah scrolls inside were not burned either. The people were so grateful to Osnat that they renamed the synagogue after her. After a long life of leadership, Rabbi Osnat Barzani died and was buried in Ahmadiyya. People from all over came to visit her grave. They continued to ask for her blessings, believing she had the power to heal them. Today, her story lives on in the legends of Iraq. They tell of a woman with a curious mind, kind heart, and, according to some, miraculous power, the first female rabbi in history. So thank you all for listening. That's the end of the story, but the beginning of our discussion. As I said, Osnat was born in 1590 Kurdistan, in the city of Mosul. And I think her story has so much power for us still today. I think in some ways it presents a more progressive and inclusive version of Judaism than some parts of some forms of Judaism exhibit still today in 2021. So I think there's a lot to learn from her, and I would love it if anyone has questions, please feel free to chime in. Don't be shy. I love questions.
Well, I'm happy to start. First of all, it's a beautiful story. And I hope, or perhaps you would consider a glossary for the book and some explanations, because I think it would be helpful for those who may not have a background to kind of just talk to, so that they can, because it's filled with, you're a wonderful teacher, and it's filled with all kinds of wonderful nuggets. So from what you know, is the dove part of her, is a part of her life, or is that a literary invention of yours?
So I didn't invent the dove. The dove features in a lot of legends and stories about her. We have a bunch of stories about Osnat thanks to amulets that actually Kurdish women have worn for centuries, in which they kept fragments and stories and legends about Osnat. Both Kurdish Jewish women, but also Kurds broadly, not only Jews, love Osnat and are so proud of her story. And so it's really thanks to their sort of stewardship of these materials that we still today have those legends. And so the dove definitely features prominently in them. It's sort of like this dove is like her kind of almost magical, mystical sidekick. I wish I had a mystical sidekick bird also, because this bird, according to the legends, used to warn her whenever there was danger afoot. For example, one of the legends that didn't make it into the book because I didn't think it's super appropriate for kids, but I'll tell you all, is that Osnat had, there was a neighbor who was lusting after her and wanted to intrude in her house one night. And the bird, she was asleep, and the bird, sensing this danger, hooted loudly at just the right moment to warn her. And she sprang out of bed, detected the danger, and whispering some mystical Kabbalistic incantation, froze the intruder to the roof beams of her house and refused to let him down until the governor the next morning passed by in the street and promised that if she released this intruder, justice would be done to him. So there's like lots of great legends about Osnat and this dove and the kind of symbiotic relationship they had. So not my invention.
So how much of this, and then picking up on Amy Karp's question, how much of this is really rooted in the mystical tradition, do you think?
I think like one thing that's really special about Osnat, coming from this Mizrahi context, is that there is a total, a total welcoming of both the scholarly and the mystical aspects. I think sometimes in other traditions, you find really like a focus just on the Talmudic mind, right? Just like the scholarly mind, that sort of analytical rigor. And she definitely had that. We have a few extant letters that she wrote. And when you read them, you can see, first of all, her Hebrew, her writing is very lyrical, like she wrote like a poet. And her writing is filled with constant, allusions to all sorts of different, Talmudic sources, Midrashic sources, but also Kabbalistic sources. You see that she's very steeped in both the sort of Talmudic rigor and the mystical dimensions. Her father was known as a Kabbalist, and he taught her, as you heard in the story. So I think it's interesting because actually when I was workshopping the manuscript for this book, some folks told me, you should leave all that like mystical mumbo jumbo out. If you're trying to have this taken seriously as a historical biography, then just the facts, ma'am. And miracles are not facts. And I just said, no, I'm not going to cut out that aspect of her story, because that is a big part of who she was and the cultural context she was coming up in. And I didn't want to erase that from her.
So speaking of research, Barbara Brown wants to know, how did you conduct your research and where?
So the scholar, the Israeli scholar, Renee Levine Melamed, is probably the foremost scholar on Osnat Barzani. There's not many people who study Kurdish Jews, but she's one of them. And luckily, I am able to read Hebrew because all the scholarship that she's written on Osnat is in Hebrew. So I started by reading her academic articles about Osnat. And those articles include, excerpts from letters that Osnat wrote to her contemporaries, rabbis in Kurdistan, and also letters that her male rabbi contemporaries wrote to her. And you can see from reading those letters how much they revered her. All these rabbis from all around were asking her for advice. And I mentioned in the book that the one that really strikes me is a letter by one Rabbi Pinchas Hariri, who opens with the salutation, "My mother, my rabbi." That's how he calls her. And I remember being really struck by that juxtaposition of words, because you never really see those two together. So I contacted this scholar, Renee Levine Melamed, talked to her a bit about Osnat, also had her read and fact check the book before it went to publication. There are a couple of manuscripts that written by and about Osnat that I really wanted to see, the originals, and I had grand plans to go to the National Library in Jerusalem to get my hands on these, and then COVID came along and thwarted my ability to see them in person. But luckily there's digital copies. And then in terms of the Kurdish context, I was very, I'm a journalist in my day job. And so I was dead set on having like perfect historical accuracy. And I really didn't want to misrepresent anything in the Kurdish context. And so I reached out to experts in the Kurdish Jewish history of that era, historians, ethnomusicologists, asking them questions like, what would the textiles, what would the fabrics have looked like? Would Osnat have covered her hair or not? At her wedding, would the men and women have danced together or separately? Which specific musical instruments would they have played at a Kurdish Jewish wedding? And they told me that the zorna, which is like a horn, and the davul drum, which you can still see Kurdish Jews in Israel to this day play at wedding ceremonies. So that was the type of research that went into this. First, a lot of reading, then talking to scholars and trying to pin down the details of the Kurdish context.
Do you think that this story could have happened in the Ashkenazic community? I mean, is there something, we have, Bruria comes to mind as, as a Talmudic example of a woman who's learning, won the respect, not only of Rabbi Meir, but of those around her.
Mm-hmm.
But she was a little bit more on the acerbic side of life. And she did have a little bit of an edge at times. And maybe she needed to have that. But I wonder if there's something about the Sephardic culture that made it possible for Osnat to become this rabbinic figure.
Yeah, I love that question. And I think the answer is absolutely yes. We do see in the Ashkenazic tradition, a few centuries after Osnat lived, women like the Maiden of Ludmir, who came along and she was a Hasidic Rebbe, these sorts of charismatic figures. But still there was a lot of gender divide, she was not able to waltz into the yeshiva and just teach the men face to face, just like that. I think that there's the Sephardic and Mizrahi communities are actually typically have a very tolerant and inclusive worldview. Not in every instance and in every responsum or everything you're going to read, but broadly, if you read a lot of responsa by Sephardic and Mizrahi rabbis, I think a lot of people would be surprised at how inclusive and tolerant their worldview was. So that's one piece. The other piece is really the Kurdish context itself. Nowadays, some of us, might hear about, a few years ago, you might have heard about Kurdish women fighting ISIS, right? Kurdish women as warriors and soldiers. But this tradition of being willing to lift up women to high positions and sometimes unconventional positions in society stretches back hundreds of years in Kurdistan. So among Kurds, there were women, heads of their, chiefs of their tribes, warriors, philosophers, poetesses. Certainly not every Kurdish woman got to be in that lofty a position, but Kurdish society broadly did make room for exceptional women to hold these exceptional high positions. So I think Osnat had the double luck of being Kurdish and being Mizrahi Jewish, and also just got lucky with having a father who was a Barzani. And the Barzanis are a big deal in Kurdistan and today it's still in Iraq. So he had the sort of clout, I think, to be able to say, this is my daughter, she's a brilliant leader. Anyone has a problem with that, just deal with it.
That's a great answer. So Barry Ballack was asking about the age bracket for the book and who is it written for, but he also has a follow-up question to you directly, which is whether Osnat hasn't convinced you yet to go to rabbinical school.
I love that question. Okay, so the first part was the age, right? So ostensibly, this is a book for kids, but it's a little sneaky because it's also kind of trying to get underneath to their adults too, their grown-ups who are around them and maybe going to be reading this book to them, because I think that almost nobody knows that Osnat Barzani existed, whatever age they're at. Even my friends who are rabbis women rabbis who are maharats, even they had not heard, for the most part, of Osnat Barzani. So I think basically someone of any age can learn something from the book and can benefit from being exposed to her story. So technically, I think it's probably best for readers between age 4 and 10, 11, 12. But really, I would say kind of for anyone, and I would emphasize not just for girls, but for any gender, because I think it's just as important for boys to grow up knowing this history of what women have been and can be in Judaism, just as much as it's important for girls to know. The question about going to rabbinical school at this stage, I have thought about it sometimes. I think I love Jewish texts very, very passionately, and that aspect of it definitely like calls me. But I think I'm just ultimately I love writing too much to forgo that as my full-time thing. I really like getting to write fiction and also do journalism that I find very meaningful in my regular job. So I'm too reluctant at this point to give that up, I think. But I really am like inspired by and so happy to see that like whenever friends of mine, including in the Orthodox community, Orthodox women are assuming positions as rabbis, as maharats in synagogues around the world. That makes me really happy because I feel like they are the modern day Osnats.
We are living in a new age, and that's something really exciting, and it's powerful to note that this has come to the Orthodox world. Our congregation has had a history of male chazanim over the years, and just last week we announced that we hired a woman as our senior cantor. So those are all kind of very powerful moments. I'm glad to see that you're following that great country western song, "Don't Let Your Daughters Grow Up to Be Rabbis." But that's so. Amy Karp is asking, are there any similarities between your father and Rabbi Barzani?
Yes, so I'm glad you asked that. So my dad, wonder if actually he's in this. I wonder if actually he's in the Zoom right now, because he had asked me to send him the Zoom link because he always likes to come to these presentations and discussions. My dad is a former professor of Jewish mysticism, and similar to Rabbi Barzani and his daughter Osnat, my dad taught me Torah and Talmud and Midrash and Kabbalah from a young age. I was going to an Orthodox day school when I was a kid, but then that was just like curriculum A. And then when I would come home from school, I had curriculum B, where then my dad would sit down with me at the dining room table and teach me Zohar or Isaac Luria or whatever it was, and we would read together. So I got very lucky in that sense. I think I do feel like he's very similar to Rabbi Barzani in the sense that he was always very supportive of me, like reading and learning any texts I wanted. And I remember, he was the only person to whom I confessed my secret dream of becoming a rabbi. And I remember being actually in my bedroom, and I had 2 shelves stacked with all the volumes of the Talmud. And I remember pointing at them and saying, like, again, this was in the Orthodox world. I remember pointing at them and saying, like, but I'm a girl, who's gonna teach me all this? And he said, like, if you want it, you will find it. So he like always encouraged me to kind of go down whatever path I wanted. And I'm sure that if he had known that Osnat Barzani existed, he probably would have told me, look, someone did this even in 1590, so I'm sure you can do it today.
The illustrations are really extraordinary in the book. They're just beautiful and soft and inviting. And here I'm picking up on Sarah Aaron's question. What's the collaboration like between the writer and the illustrator?
It's sort of a funny, it's a funny thing in the children's book publishing industry. You maybe would, well, so there's a funny process. As the writer, when you just submit the text, you don't get to choose the illustrator. Your publisher chooses the illustrator, but they will run a few options by you and see, are you okay with this one? Are you going to veto this one? If this illustrator does your book, are you going to hate the book? We don't want that because we want you to promote it. So my publisher found this illustrator, Vali Mintzi, and the reason I knew that I would be happy with her as the illustrator for this book is that she previously illustrated a book about an Iranian girl. So similar kind of cultural, geographic location, and she did that book beautifully. And I felt like she really nailed the sort of like cultural and historical sensitivity and accuracy piece of it, which was very important to me. I especially really did not want Osnat to look white because she decidedly was not a white girl. And I think this illustrator really got it. So then what happens is the illustrator will read your text without talking to you, the writer, at all, because like the idea is that the illustrator should imagine it how they imagine it and not be constrained by how the writer pictures it. Which I'm a little bit like, to be honest, I'm a little bit of a control freak. So that is a challenging process for me to undergo. But I just sort of had to trust and like let her read and draw what she would draw. She drew some sketches. The publisher showed them to me just to give a thumbs up, thumbs down. Any glaring errors that you find in this? No, there weren't. And then she did the full color paintings, the illustrations. And the thing that made me confident in her was that she was asking a lot for sources. She, like me, was like obsessed with getting it just right, all the details, the food, the clothes, the architecture. So she was kind of looking at archaeological sources. What does the town of Ahmadiyya look like? Looking at books about the textiles that they had in that era, all those sorts of details. So I think like I got really lucky with her as the illustrator, and maybe it should encourage me to be less of a control freak and trust a publisher when he says he's found a good illustrator.
I have one last question. And as you told your story, the sun was going down here in Chicago, and it's now Rosh Chodesh Iyar, which is not only a focus on the miracle of the modern state of Israel, but it's also an opportunity to celebrate the role of women in Jewish life and the faith components that they bring to the Jewish people and have throughout time, not only in the time of Moses, but to this very day. But we also have to be aware of the role that the feminine form plays in Jewish mystical life and in Jewish mystical thought. So since we're talking about a woman, the first woman rabbi, so to speak, what gifts do women bring to the study of Torah that are unique, and that we should be celebrating? Not just that women study Torah, which of course is central and important and vital, especially today, but what gifts do you think women bring, unique gifts that bring to the study of Torah?
I think that first of all, women bring all the same gifts as men bring.
No question.
The same, the same analytical rigor, the same genius, the same everything. Plus, they bring the perspective that you probably to some extent can only have if you've grown up as a girl, as a woman. I think that the Torah is obviously a text that we want to have speak to all humans. And to the extent that like historically Judaism has broadly like left out half the population of humans in terms of who's interpreting these texts, we've impoverished Judaism by half. Judaism is 50% as rich as it could have been and should be.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's only about, I think sometimes you'll find in the more orthodox Jewish streams that are creating programs for women to study halacha and all that, there's sometimes a focus on women's issues like nida, family purity, like all this sort of stuff. Sure, that too, but also like what is a woman's perspective on Plaga Mincha, or like a story in the Bible, or a bit of a Gadata in the Talmud, or anything, right? I don't think we should conceive of it as women only have unique insight into women's issues, right? Women have unique insight into all aspects of Judaism.
There's no question. There's no question. And I was thinking as you were telling the story that the Jewish people would be far better off if we had rabbis or women rabbis earlier on. I think they bring a sense of love and mercy to those aspects, not only to their lives but to the study of Torah. And I think that Judaism is that much better today because we are blessed with Maharats and but also women rabbis in the non-Orthodox community. And I think Judaism is a much better place, at least in America, for that. And it's good to know that this tradition goes back all the way back to Kurdistan.
Yeah.
And thank you for bringing her to our attention and to so many others. On behalf of all of us, Sigal, we thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, Julian, for your comment. And I think there have been some, I really encourage you to sort of share this book if you can with parents kids and I think Amy might have the information about the book that has them.
Sure. The books have been purchased and are available for I should say the books have been ordered, are available for purchase at our local independent bookstore, Unabridged, on Broadway. And I encourage everyone. I know I'm buying one for my granddaughter, and I hope that everybody will follow suit. I think it's a great story that has a wonderful example for our girls growing up. So thank you very much. I really appreciate everything you've presented tonight and your willingness to meet with us on a lovely Tuesday evening.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming by.
Lila Tov.
Lila Tov. Thank you so much, Sigal.
Take care.